Lori Peek is an award-winning scholar and one of the world's leading experts on children and disasters. She spent nearly a decade after Hurricane Katrina studying children's experiences, and she's the co-author of a book called Children of Katrina. She also wrote the book Behind the Backlash, Muslim Americans After 9/11. And she is co-editor of Displaced: Life in Katrina Diaspora. Peek is deeply committed to children's safety in disasters, and she recently helped create Safer, Stronger, Smarter, a guide to improving school natural hazard safety, which is the first natural hazard school safety guidance for the nation. She is the director of the Natural Hazards Center and a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. Please, let's give a good Rancho Mirage welcome to Dr. Lori Peek.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to talk to you this evening about children and disasters. And I'm actually going to draw this evening on many decades, 2 decades almost in total, of experience with studying children in disasters or young people in disasters. And so my experience starting with studying children and young people really began with the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And then I launched several studies after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and then began work after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, did work after the Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake in 2011, after the Joplin tornado also in 2011, after Superstorm Sandy, and most recently after Hurricane Matthew in North Carolina. And in thinking about all of those different disasters that I've been to and all of the literature that I've read over the years, Dennis, when I was talking to him getting ready for this talk, we were talking about what might be most important to share. And we really landed on this question about not what is it that I have learned, but what is it that children have taught me in these communities that have been struck low by disaster. And so in these 20 minutes that I have with you tonight, I really want to share with you 5 lessons that I have learned directly from children. And so the number one lesson that I have learned from kids is to pay attention to kids and to pay attention to them before a disaster strikes and to pay attention to them during a disaster and to pay attention after a disaster. In this nation, children who are between the ages of 0 to 17 make up about a quarter of our national population. Children make up a smaller percentage of the population here in Rancho Mirage. But what we know about kids is that kids are 100% of our future. And we have a responsibility to listen to them and to listen to what they have to say. And something we know is that children today are coming of age in a world that is drier and hotter and more subject to severe storms and sea level rise and other forms of disaster than at any other moment in history. And so when children are speaking up and when children are asking questions about these disasters and about what these disasters might mean in their lives today, but also in the future, it's really important that we pay attention. Second big lesson that I have learned from children, and especially have learned from watching children in these disaster-affected areas, is that children have a deep and abiding desire to help in disaster. And that was perhaps never more apparent to me than after the 2011 Christchurch, New Zealand disaster. That earthquake was a 6.3 magnitude earthquake that devastated the city of Christchurch and several of the surrounding areas. It devastated the central business district and led to building collapse. Much of the cultural property in Christchurch and the surrounding area was badly damaged. Homes were damaged, chimneys fell off, there was liquefaction, and there was devastation all around among the population. But in addition to the devastation and the distress that I witnessed in Christchurch after that earthquake, I also saw this. This is a picture of the Student Volunteer Army. And the Student Volunteer Army actually started to come together after the 2010 Christchurch earthquake. A young man named Sam Johnson set up a Facebook page, and he sent out a message to 200 of his friends on Facebook. And he said, "Is there any chance you want to show up and help?" And next thing, there were thousands of kids who showed up after the 2010 Christchurch earthquake. And later, Sam Johnson would say this was like a dress rehearsal, because it was the 2011 Christchurch earthquake, the 6.3 magnitude, that ended up leading to the building collapse and to nearly 200 persons losing their lives. And so this Student Volunteer Army showed up again en masse. In 1 week alone, over 13,000 young people gathered together with one goal and one intent in mind. They wanted to know, how can we help? And help they did. They shoveled up thousands and thousands and thousands of wheelbarrows of liquefaction. They picked up bricks that had fallen off elderly people's homes. They brought the chemical toilets to people's houses that needed them after the earthquake. And they otherwise helped out in ways that were really necessary. They also innovated after that disaster in incredible ways, because as these thousands of young people were showing up, they were being asked to fill out paper forms. And that took a long time. And they're of the cell phone generation. And they said, we don't want to fill out paper forms. And so what they did is they came together and they actually created a technological fix where they could complete the forms that they needed to complete for the emergency management agencies, but they could do it more quickly so they could get out and do what they wanted to do, which was to help after that earthquake. Now, the third lesson that I've learned, both from young people but also from adults in these disaster-affected communities that I've visited, is that even though children continue to express this strong desire to help, that there are many barriers to their ability to actually be able to help. And so one barrier is obviously that some children are truly too young to help. Infants and very young children oftentimes are in need of complete protection and complete support in the event of a disaster. And so when we talk about children in disaster, it's always really important to differentiate. Are we talking about really young children and what might they need in a disaster, as opposed to older adolescents and teens who really may be available to contribute in different kinds of ways? So sometimes kids are too young. Sometimes we know in disasters that it's truly too dangerous for children to help. After the BP oil spill, I spent a lot of time in oil-soaked communities along our US Gulf Coast. And the thing the teens were telling me is they said, we want to get out. These are our beaches where we fish and where we play and where we swim. And they've been devastated. And all we want to do is help. But of course, the people who were in charge of the oil spill cleanup said, no way, there's no way young people are going to come out and be a part of this oil spill cleanup because it's too dangerous. And they were right, it was too dangerous. But what we maybe could think more creatively about together, are there other ways that children could get involved and could really help in their communities where they can channel that desire to be a part of something bigger than themselves? Now, a third barrier that I think we absolutely, some of this we can do something about. Children are oftentimes excluded in every sort of way from the organizations and institutions that actually make decisions that have a profound effect on their lives. Children don't vote in this country, and so they literally do not have a political voice. But children also oftentimes aren't in the boardrooms and the commission rooms, and they're not in the places where decisions are being made. And that's changing in some places. The Federal Emergency Management Agency now has a Youth Preparedness Council where those young people actually have a chance to have a voice about emergency preparedness in their communities. And so sometimes it may make sense that children aren't in the halls of power and aren't making decisions, but sometimes we might ask ourselves, is there a place where young people actually could contribute and could have a voice and speak on behalf of issues that really do affect their lives? Now, Another reason that children sometimes get excluded from preparedness activities are because of myths about what we call myths about kids. And so one of the myths is that if you talk to children about disasters and you try to get them to prepare, as Bunny and others really are working so hard to do, that many people say we can't talk to kids about these things. But research has shown that children do know about disasters. We live in a 24/7 news cycle, and they're being constantly exposed to these events. And so what research has shown is actually if you don't talk to kids about disasters, what's going to fill the void is that they get really scared, and they get more anxious than if you just talk to them in age-appropriate ways. Now, other myths about children is that they just don't care, that they don't want to help, or that they can't help. And again, time after time after time across all of these disasters, what we keep seeing is that children do want to help. And that brings me to the fourth point, which is how can children help? We've already seen one example of this. But something that Alice Fothergill, who's another sociologist who we followed children for nearly 10 years after Hurricane Katrina. And not only did we want to understand why were children especially vulnerable in Hurricane Katrina, we also wanted to understand how did children help after that disaster. And so we came up with this, and we said there were really 3 big ways that children helped. They helped adults, they helped other children and youth, and then ultimately they helped themselves. And so I'm going to just kind of quickly walk you through some examples of ways that children helped in each of these categories. And as you're very politely listening, I hope that you might think about where are places and spaces where you've seen children help out in your community or in other places that may look similar to this. So some of the ways that we found children oftentimes help adults is that they do things to help prepare for the impending disaster. And so before the various storms that we've looked at, oftentimes it was children who had read a book, who had had a lesson in school, and they took that lesson home, and they helped their adults in their family, their parents and other caregivers to actually get ready. Children also did things like promoting evacuation and sheltering behaviors. We learned from many of the parents in our various studies that many parents told us that they would not have evacuated or would not have taken recommended protective actions if the kids had not come home from school and chided the parents to do that work. We also saw that we would hope this would never happen in a disaster, but the fact of the matter is, most people who get rescued after a disaster, they're not necessarily rescued from outside organizations that are coming in. They're rescued by fellow survivors. And we actually heard many, many stories after Hurricane Katrina in particular, where tens of thousands of people were trapped in a flooded city, of young people rescuing the adults, oftentimes elderly or persons with disabilities after that disaster. And so one of the young men who we interviewed after Katrina actually talked about this. He said, I was already home with my mom when the news, on the news, and they said that it was going to be a Category 5 hurricane. And then when it started raining hard and she knew that we had to leave, and the water was up to my waist, and I came back to my mom at the boat, and the water was then up to my neck, and I had to hold my mom. A fourth big way that we found that children oftentimes supported the adults in their lives was emotionally. Through the adults oftentimes said it was their need to help care for the kids, and the kids who were giving them emotional support that helped with their recovery. We also learned a lot about how, with children, one of the big recommendations after disaster, the number one thing is to get them back into a routine in order to put them on a path to recovery. But oftentimes, it wasn't just adults imposing that on children. It was children who were asking the adults in their lives to create new routines after those disasters that helped with the recovery. We also found that children did a lot of volunteering after the disaster, and as you just heard with the student volunteer army example. Also, children had a big influence on parental decision-making, both before the disaster in terms of evacuating, but also children have a big influence on whether parents are going to stay in place after a disaster, and sometimes we overlook that when we're trying to understand this phenomenon. We also know children did a lot to raise funds for their communities. Okay. Now, how did children help other children in the disaster? So some of the examples we found was that children didn't just help adults, they also helped to get their younger siblings out in Katrina. We also found that oftentimes it was the children who were helping to calm other children during the most chaotic and scary moments during the disaster because they trusted other children. We also saw many times as we've been in and out of shelters across many different disasters that it's oftentimes the children who end up organizing various activities for fellow children and support those children in those shelters. Sometimes that looks like sticking together. So sometimes in shelters when the children would have to get ready for school, they would get ready together and they would go together. Other times, what that help looked like was that they would communicate with one another. And sometimes setting up these peer-to-peer communication networks is one of the most important things we can do after disaster, because young people may not want to talk to adults in their lives, but they may be comfortable talking to fellow peers. And one of the young girls who we interviewed talked about this. She said, if something's really wrong, my friends at school, they'd see there's something wrong with me, and they would always be like, what's wrong? And then I'd be like, leave me alone, nothing, get away from me. But still, when you tell your friends that, they won't leave. They'll sit there and they'll be like, we aren't leaving until you talk. That really makes me feel like they really are my friends. And so thinking about, again, how can we channel this energy of children and youth and their capacities to help one another? Children also did a variety of things like taking on jobs after Katrina to help their families, but also to help their siblings. We open our book, Children of Katrina, with a story of a little boy named Daniel who had a mother and had a younger sister. And after the storm, Daniel got his first job in his life when he turned 16 years old. And we saw him, we said, Daniel, how are you doing? How are you doing with your job? And what are you doing with the money you're raising? And this is what he said to us. He said, I was so worried about Alexandria, and that's his little sister, not having Christmas, that I made sure that she knew that she had toys for Christmas. It would have been her third or fourth Christmas, and this is the 3 or 4 years after Katrina, without gifts. Because I remember days when I didn't have anything for Christmas or when I didn't get anything for my birthday. I wanted to make sure she has a good birthday experience, a good holiday experience. In addition to taking on jobs, we also saw that children would raise funds and other material donations. And one of the things that we're starting to see in these disaster-affected communities is oftentimes once a child or a young person has been through a disaster, they're taking that experience and mobilizing for other children in other disaster-affected regions. So one of the girls, Isabel, who went through Katrina, this is what she told us that she and her classmates did. I feel like we can relate to what they're going through. And here she's talking about kids after the Haiti earthquake. Maybe not exactly the same, but the feeling of having to start over. I think that here in New Orleans, people can really sympathize or empathize with the people because they kind of know what they are going through. And I think we've all seen how much people can help. So we kind of want to go above and beyond in giving and in help. And so sometimes when we think about what might spark preparedness in Rancho Mirage, sometimes one of the things that might help here is exactly what you're doing, bringing people from other communities. And so I think, what if we brought Sam Johnson here to talk about how do you actually get young people going before the earthquake strikes? Okay. Children also did a lot of things like founding their own new youth-led organizations because they started to see their power of what they could do in a disaster. We also learned some about what non-disaster affected youth did for children in communities that received lots of survivors. And so these non-disaster affected children, they did things like helping with the adjustment of fellow children, giving. In Denver, Colorado, we received about 15,000 Hurricane Katrina survivors after the disaster. And one of the things that young people in partnership with the fire stations in Denver did is they made blankets and they did a Warmth of Colorado campaign where they gave all of the children who came to Colorado a blanket to help welcome them to this new place that was totally unfamiliar, and they also gave them a gift card so that they could be ready to buy something for Christmas. They also did things like supporting other youth through doing things like fundraising drives and also drives to get school uniforms for children. Now, a final area that we learned a lot about was how helping other people, helping adults and helping children could actually help disaster-affected children to recover. And so some of the things that we learned here was that through going through preparedness programs, that it was children who they would say, this actually helped in my own recovery. I will never forget one of the little boys that we interviewed after Katrina. I said, what was most important for you that you took in the evacuation? And he said, oh, it was a shell that my grandma gave me. And he ran upstairs to his bedroom and he grabbed this little shell that had come off the beach. And his mom is sitting there, just tears running down her face because she had no idea about any of this. And he opens his hand and he has this shell. And he said, I went through something in my school where they told me to pack up the thing that is most important to me. And he said, my grandma died the year before Hurricane Katrina. And so I took this shell with me so that I could feel comfortable and safe in the evacuation. And so that was a big thing. Children being educated and then being empowered to do these things helped with their recovery. Children also played games after the various disasters that we've been in that really helped them to process their disaster experience. We found that children often really needed to watch and to listen and to learn from adults. So again, this idea that not talking to children isn't an effective way to deal with disaster, that instead it's really important to talk to them about what they're going through. We also learned a lot about how important the investment in the arts and in creative spaces, how important that is to children. And we actually saw many of the children after the Joplin tornado, they had many mural projects in their community that helped children to design murals and to actually create murals where they could process their recovery. After Hurricane Katrina, one of the girls that we followed for 10 years, her name is Sierra, and she was actually deeply, deeply traumatized in the disaster. She and her mom were stuck in a hospital. Her mom had gone to work as a vital employee, and then the hurricane made landfall. And Sierra and her mom were trapped for what felt like endless days and nights in this hospital. They got out. They were taken to a large mass shelter about 2 hours to the west of New Orleans. They ended up in a temporary trailer and had this very long and protracted and traumatic recovery. And Sierra definitely was acting out and was having some anger issues, and her mom was able to get her help through a creative arts program in her school. And when Alice and I interviewed her in the years after Katrina, we would ask her, what really helped you to recover? And she would point to the adults in her life, to the schools, to the various activities she was in, but she would also often talk about the arts and how important they were. So I'm going to read you a brief poem that Sierra wrote where she actually declared to us that she was recovered. This is called The Saga. One bad thing which seems to have split at the age of 6. And here she's talking about her parents' divorce when she was 6 years old. Since then, pain invited itself into the life of the child with its waters and winds who removed the child from the love of her city into a new one she knew exactly nothing about. Now, 3 years have gone, and that city turned from her house to her home. We also found that using social media was very important to children after the disaster, that was one of their main ways for communicating and finding out that their family and friends were safe. They also did things where they would actually actively support themselves, and so they would talk about how important it was to be in programs where they had time to process and to write. And so taken together, when we look at these different things that children can do, this leads me to my fifth and final point and where I will leave you this evening, that I think the biggest lesson across all these disasters that we've learned about is that children helping themselves and helping others, including their families and their organizations in their communities, that's actually one of the best ways that we can advance preparedness, response, and recovery for our broader communities, but also for our society. And with that, thank you so much for listening to me, and I cannot wait to hear Marcia. Thank you.